semester, I took a whole class on the book of Ezekiel. Not because I wanted to, but because a Hebrew class is required to graduate, and Ezekiel was the only one being offered at BU. I did try to get into a Psalms class at Boston College, much more fun, but it was unfortunately already full. So I prepared myself for a semester of 8 a.m. classes on a book of the Bible that I did not know very much about. The only passage from Ezekiel that I knew was the passage that we read in service today, the Valley of the Dry Bones. I grew up in Sunday school singing about these bones. Some of you may have heard this song. The toe bone's connected to the foot bone's connected to the heel bone's connected to the ankle bone, and so on and so forth. I definitely won't subject you to the whole song. It is very long, and I think one of the reasons that it was sung in my Sunday school class was because it ate up a good chunk of time going through all the bones of the body. This image, this passage of the Valley of the Dry Bones, it is powerful and maybe a little bit spooky. A valley full of skeletons slowly coming back together and living again. This is an image that has been with me since a very young age, but I must admit that I had very little context for it. I didn't know who these bones were, how they died, or why God would bring them back to life. And I didn't know anything about Ezekiel, his life, his ministry, the time he lived through. But after a long semester of 8 a.m. classes, I do. So let me tell you the story of Ezekiel that leads up to this moment. And get ready for something that should be made into a Game of Thrones-esque show. Ezekiel was a priest living in Jerusalem during a particularly tumultuous time in Judah's history. Ezekiel was a good priest, concerned with following God's law and making sure that the worship of God was practiced correctly. However, when he was 25, Ezekiel was forced to leave his home of Jerusalem. See, since before Ezekiel was born, the Neo-Babylonian Empire had been gaining more and more power in the region, and Ezekiel's home country of Judah had the unfortunate luck of being located between Babylonia and another major power in the region, Egypt. So the Babylonians needed to create a buffer zone between them and the Egyptians, and what better way to do that than to seize control of Judah? So when the Babylonians attacked Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, no one was really surprised. The Babylonians rounded up the elites of Jerusalem, the king, the nobles, the priests, including Ezekiel, and sent them off to Babylon. They then established a puppet king and made Judah a vassal kingdom. So now Ezekiel, the promising priest, was in Babylon, far away from home and the temple, scared about what may happen to his people. This is when Ezekiel started his prophetic career. This is when the book starts, telling everyone still back in Jerusalem that their vassal status would not last forever, and the city would fall to the Babylonians. And it so happens that Ezekiel was right. While he was in exile, the puppet king in Jerusalem decided to lead a rebellion against the Babylonians, resulting in a 30-month siege of Jerusalem that ended with the destruction of the city and the exile of the few surviving inhabitants to Babylon. It's a lot of backstory, but just be glad I left out the names of kings that all sound so confusingly similar. So this is the man that God shows the vision of the Valley of the Dry Bones. Ezekiel is a man that has lost his home, his religious practices, and probably countless family, friends, and acquaintances. On top of that, he wholeheartedly believes that God has caused his home to be destroyed because of the sinfulness of Israel. So how does someone move forward from something like that? Well, it takes Ezekiel a while to. Throughout the whole first half of the book, Ezekiel is a prophet of doom. But when he's ready, he turns to hope. So in this most famous vision of the book, God brings Ezekiel to a valley. That valley is full of the bones of fallen soldiers. This is how Ezekiel understands his home at the moment, his people, and even his religious practices. Everything is dead. The people apparently have a saying, "Our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off from God." And Ezekiel's vision is that saying come to life, completely surrounded by dry bones. So God shows Ezekiel this valley and asks Ezekiel, can these bones live? What a question for God to ask Ezekiel. Can these bones live? Everything has gone wrong for Ezekiel and his people. They've lost countless lives and are stuck far away from home. And yet God asks Ezekiel, can these bones live? Ezekiel plays it pretty safe with his answer. He tells God, only you know. It's like, I don't want to get this question wrong, which honestly is a smart answer. Ezekiel has no way to know if he will be allowed back to the land of his birth. No way to know if he'll be able to worship in the temple again. He's right that only God knows. I imagine quite the cinematic scene that comes next. Ezekiel, with his figurative hopelessness made concrete around him, and God promises that the dead will live again. And slowly, if this were a movie, the music begins to build as the bones begin to rattle and come together one by one until Ezekiel is surrounded by everything that he had lost alive again. I imagine the triumphant roar is almost deafening. And then I imagine a cutaway to Ezekiel waking up in a dark room alone again, because this is just a vision after all. But knowing that restoration and rebuilding are possible. What a beautiful image. A beautiful promise that despite the despair of the moment, things will return to the way they used to be. With our historical hindsight, we know that much of this vision bears out. The exiles in Babylon do get a chance to return to Jerusalem 70 years after they left. They get to rebuild a temple. The worship of God continues, and the Babylonian exile is not the end of the story. The bones do live again. But something still doesn't sit quite right with me. I think about the bones reattaching to each other. Bodies that were broken, knitting themselves back together. Anyone who has a scar can tell you that a body knitting itself together often leaves a mark. Our bodies are hardly ever the same after they break. A broken toe never bends the same way. Injured joints eventually develop arthritis. Healing, hope, and they're not necessarily the same thing as complete restoration. Maybe the bones can live again, but I have a hard time believing that those rebuilt bodies wouldn't feel the impact of their death. I have a hard time believing that their joints wouldn't ache and their fingers wouldn't bend a little funny. Despite the figurative restoration of the bones 70 years later, we know that the dead did not literally come back to life. The people who died of hunger during the siege, were slain in the fall of Jerusalem, or died in captivity, they never returned home. And when the exiles do get the chance to return 70 years later, it is a completely different group of people who are going back. Almost everyone who went back was born in Babylon. Many with parents or grandparents that were born in Babylon. Life has happened in the intervening 70 years, and it is not possible that the people that were taken into Babylonian captivity were the same people that returned 70 years later. This is a different set of bones entirely. It is often hard to perceive the change of time when you are in it. It is a lot easier to see the change when you aren't there. When I went back to Texas, the Christmas break of my freshman year of college, it really felt like going home. Everything was familiar, and there were so many people still there that I struggled to see everybody that I wanted to see. Although my childhood bedroom was already cleaned out and given to a foreign exchange student, even though my childhood bedroom was already cleaned out and given to a foreign exchange student, everything still felt like home. However, every time I went back, things felt less and less familiar. My parents eventually painted and rearranged the furniture as our kids went off to college one by one. Every time I came back, a new restaurant had taken over the place in the strip mall that used to be the Starbucks where I studied for AP Bio. Then my parents moved to India, and I wasn't even able to stay in my childhood home when I came back. It really didn't feel like home anymore. I think most people have similar experiences, but it feels especially stark when you only see a place once or twice a year. There came a point when I realized that my home didn't really exist anymore. The town had changed too much. I had changed too much. And there was no going back. Not really. I have to believe that Ezekiel and the other exiles faced a similar, if much more tragic, reality. Ezekiel may have envisioned restoration, the same dead coming back to life, but I wonder if what happened was more akin to a new beginning than to a return of the old. The exiles who returned were a different set of people. And in later prophetic books, you can read about the changed Judah they encountered when they returned. The past was gone, but there was a new life that was possible ahead of them. In times of despair, when everything seems impossible, it is sometimes easiest just to hope that what is lost will be restored. It is sometimes easier to hope that things will become like they used to be. When we are in a space of loss and grief, hope is especially hard. Because what we want is to have back what we lost, even when we know that is not possible. Hoping for the past to come back is often a losing game. And we are selling the future short when we hope like this. The summer after I graduated from college, I went to Texas for a visit. Flying back to Boston, my first thought when I landed was that it was good to be home. My old home may not have existed anymore, but in that moment I knew I had built a new one. The bones had knit themselves back together, but they were not even in the same state. New life, new growth, new hope are possible even in places that feel dead. But when we want that hope, we need to be prepared for something new. We need to be prepared for a completely new life to spring forward. Can these bones live? Yes. But they cannot live unchanged. They will not be the same.